Welcome back to the Lost Tactician, where the forgotten wisdom of history meets the raw necessity of survival. Today, we're stepping into the dense pine forests of medieval Scandinavia, where Viking hands shaped timber into vessels that would conquer oceans and cathedrals that would stand for 1,000 years. The salt spray of the North Atlantic, the relentless rain hammering against wooden walls, the gnawing hunger of shipworms beneath the waterline, these forces destroyed civilizations. Yet the Norse defied them all. Their secret wasn't magic, it was mastery, and we're about to resurrect it from the grave of forgotten knowledge. The enduring mystery of Norse timber. Stand before the stave church at Ørnes, Norway, and you're confronting an impossibility. 900 years of Scandinavian weather, freezing winters that split stone, summers humid enough to rot a barn in decades. And yet, the timber remains. The dragon-headed prows of Viking longships pulled from riverbeds show wood so well preserved that scholars can still read the axe marks. Modern pressure-treated lumber, saturated with chemical arsenates and chromates, begins failing after 30 years. How did medieval craftsmen, working with nothing but fire, iron, and forest wisdom, create timber that outlasted empires? The answer lies not in a single technique, but in an industrial process so sophisticated that we nearly lost it entirely. The Vikings understood something we're only now rediscovering: that nature, given time and knowledge, produces preservatives more durable than anything manufactured in a laboratory. They didn't fight the forest, they enlisted it, unearthing the lost sap extraction methods. The process began years before a single plank was cut, deep in the pine forests where Scots pine grew thick enough to block out the winter sun. Viking woodsmen would move through these stands in late winter, when sap ran sluggish, but the trees' defences were primed, and deliberately wound the living trees, not to kill them, to provoke them. Using simple iron gouges and axes, they'd strip vertical bands of bark from the trunk or lop off major branches, creating what foresters now call resin-tapping wounds. The timing was surgical: too early in winter, and the frozen sap couldn't flow; too late in spring, and the tree's energy would go into new growth rather than resin production. Late February through early March represented the narrow window when the tree, sensing injury, would flood the wound site with resin, nature's antiseptic and sealant. Collection was patient work. Wooden or ceramic vessels would be affixed below the wounds to catch the slow amber seep of sap. But this wasn't the Vikings' primary goal. That sticky harvest was merely a byproduct. The real prize was the wood itself. Over 3 to 5 years, the wounded tree would channel resin throughout its sapwood, creating timber so saturated with natural preservatives that it would repel water like waxed canvas and resist fungal decay like stone. Scots pine resin is, well, a chemical fortress. Its primary components, abietic acid, pimaric acid, and other ditapene resin acids, are hydrophobic molecules that actively repel water. When the tree floods wounded tissue with these compounds, they crystallize within the wood's cellular structure, physically blocking the pathways moisture would normally follow. But the Vikings understood something deeper. They knew that not all pine timber was equal. Heartwood, the dark, dense core of mature trees, was already rich in extractives, natural compounds that trees produce to defend their central trunk against pathogens. By wounding the tree and forcing it to redirect resin to the sapwood, they were artificially creating heartwood-level protection throughout the entire trunk. The result was timber that, when finally felled, was pre-impregnated with preservatives before a single cut was made. This wasn't treatment, this was transformation. The wood's natural structure became a matrix of resin-bound fibers, impervious to the bacteria and fungi that consume ordinary timber. The industrial engine, tar production at scale. Resin-rich timber solved half the problem. The other half required, well, an industrial revolution, 13 centuries before the steam age, mass production of pine tar through dry distillation. Across Scandinavia, archaeological evidence reveals the scale of this operation. Forest clearings were transformed into tar production sites, where enormous conical pits, known as tjeremiller, were dug into hillsides. The physics were both brutal and elegant. Stack resin-saturated pine wood, especially the root systems where resin concentrated most heavily, into these pits. Then cover the entire mound with turf to create an oxygen-starved environment. Finally, ignite it from the top. What followed was controlled pyrolysis. The low oxygen burn prevented the wood from combusting completely, instead slowly cooking it at temperatures between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius. The heat fractured the resin's molecular bonds, liquefying it into tar that seeped down through the stack, channeling through a drainage system to collection vessels at the pit's base. A single successful burn required 3 to 5 days of constant monitoring, adjusting turf coverage to manage airflow, and maintaining temperature through experience and instinct passed down through generations. The output justified the labor: 300 liters or more of thick, black tar per kiln, enough to waterproof dozens of ships or thousands of roof shingles. Application: where chemistry meets craftsmanship. Viking shipwrights applied this tar with the precision of surgeons. Between each overlapping plank of a longship's clinker-built hull, they packed caulking, animal hair or wool, and saturated it with hot pine tar. This created a flexible, waterproof seal that could withstand the flexing and twisting of a vessel riding North Atlantic swells. But they didn't stop there. Multiple coats of tar were painted across the entire hull, creating a barrier against teredo navalis, the shipworm whose appetite for underwater timber had destroyed countless fleets. The tar's volatile compounds acted as a deterrent. Its physical coating denied the worm's purchase. Stave churches received similar attention. Built on stone foundations to prevent ground moisture from wicking into the wood, their exposed timber surfaces were treated with repeated applications of tar, particularly the ornately carved shingles that bore the brunt of Scandinavian rain. Folk wisdom, preserved in later Norwegian tradition, held that the finest tar was produced around midsummer, when extended daylight and stable weather allowed the multi-day kiln burns to proceed without interruption. Modern timber preservation relies on copper arsenates, chromates, and petrochemical derivatives, effective but ecologically devastating compounds that leach into soil and water. The Viking method required nothing but pine, fire, and time. As we confront the environmental consequences of industrial chemistry, these ancient techniques offer more than historical curiosity. They represent a proven, sustainable alternative rooted in understanding natural systems rather than overwhelming them. The longships that carried warriors across oceans and the churches that still shelter congregations testify to a profound truth. The most enduring technologies often aren't the most complex. They're the ones that work with nature's grain rather than against it. The Vikings didn't conquer the North Atlantic through superior metallurgy or tactics alone. They did it with superior timber, and that timber was born from patience. The patience to wound a tree and wait years for it to armor itself. The patience to tend a smoking tar kiln through summer nights. The patience to build things meant to outlast the builders. If you found this journey into forgotten craftsmanship valuable, honor those ancient shipwrights by hitting that like button and sharing this video. Subscribe to the Lost Tactician for more explorations of how survival, ingenuity, and history intertwine. Because the past isn't dead, it's waiting in the forest, teaching us how to endure.